Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Robby Soave, staff editor at Reason.com, and a 2010 graduate of the University of Michigan, where he earned his journalism chops on the campus newspaper. Before joining Reason, Robby was a reporter for the Daily Caller, which is kind enough to publish my opinion columns just about once a week. Robby, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Robby, we talked to Greg Piper from the College Fix earlier, and I asked you both on to bring us up to date on the contemporary college scene. I'd like to dig into the Title IX story because it's playing such a transformative role, but before we do, what's the current state of the rape crisis hysteria that's sweeping across college campuses?
Well, it's funny. We've had in the last year and a half, a lot of blowback to the idea that this is the most severe, pervasive crisis, that 1 in 5 women are going to be assaulted on campuses,
right,
that we have a Somalia-level kind of culture of sexual violence on college. We've actually had a lot of blowback to that idea. A lot of people pointing out the errors in the statistics, pointing out the problems with the methodology. When you survey these students, they actually don't even see themselves as victims unless you tell them they're victims, unless you tell them that, if you were groped once in a party, you're a victim of sexual violence. When they put the questions to them that way, then they answer differently. But there's been a lot of journalists kind of looking at stories like the UVA rape hoax, like Emma Sulkowicz, the mattress girl, the Hunting Ground documentary that was supposed to prove how horrible this is, and, half of their cases have holes in them when scrutinized. So it's been a tremendous counter effort to kind of correct how this issue has been presented. And unfortunately, the activists kind of roll right on. They've kind of ignored those. I've been shocked at the reception my work has gotten from the activist core, the left-leaning promoters of this hysteria, who just totally ignore the facts I've uncovered, the work I've done debunking the idea that most campus rapists are serial sociopathic predators who will assault over and over again until they're apprehended like serial killers or something. This is the work that's been promoted by Dr. David Lisak, who's the most famous psychologist on this issue, who's been cited by the White House and activists over and over again. And I've dug into his study, and I've laid out, we can get into that, I've laid out the myriad flaws with it, and the activists just kind of ignore it. They just keep going.
So even the president keeps quoting this debunked 1 in 5 statistic about campus rapes. What makes this campaign so impervious to correction?
Yeah, you just have a lot of advocates who they want policy change, they want cultural change, and they're not really concerned about the evidence and actually looking at what's going to be the best for victims of violence, because we know that victims of violence should bring their complaints to the criminal justice system.
Sure.
They should have them taken seriously. They should have courts put away bad people who are committing violence. We want those people going to jail. We don't want them being sent to the next college campus, which is the outcome of the process that the advocates want.
Sure.
When the campus just decides unfairly that you did something wrong and kicks you out. If they're innocent, it's bad. And if they're guilty, it's not good enough.
It might even be worse. Did we learn anything from the Rolling Stone rape hoax?
I thought we'd learned something. I thought we'd learned that if this sounds incredible, if this sounds horrifying and like it couldn't be true, maybe it isn't true. What struck me about the UVA story from the get-go was that Jackie, the alleged victim, had not been drinking. She was not intoxicated. And I know from reading about these cases, every single one of these people, usually the victim and the perpetrator, are drunk out of their mind.
Yeah, there's a lot of alcohol involved.
Alcohol abuse is central to this conflict, and that wasn't a factor there. So that's the thing that made me kind of suspicious of it. But it's almost like it's religious belief. It's not about science and statistics. It's dogmatic. We shouldn't question survivors. We shouldn't question people who come forward. Even if them coming forward is anonymous and it's not been brought to the police and they're accusing people who don't get a fair chance to respond in the media, as was the case with Jackie. And we just need to be a little more scrutinizing if we're going to enact public policy based on this.
In the midst of these almost Victorian warnings about sexual predators, college administrators have never been more open about encouraging sexual exploration. Harvard, among many schools, hosts an official Sex Week program that includes tutorials on subjects like how to enjoy anal sex or arrange a menage a trois. Aren't these trends contradictory?
Yeah, they are contradictory, and it's really weird when you look at it. There's this taboo against telling students, from like a Christian perspective or a conservative perspective that you should save sex for marriage or something. No, we can't do that. But at the same time, we're going to be really involved in policing how you're having sex and what is consent. So it's these really mixed messages that they're sending, and it's kind of baffling because in a way the administrators have become this new Victorian class of censors and of telling people what's okay.
There seems to be a tremendous asymmetry in all this. Under the current yes mean yes rules, a woman is not able to give consent if she's been drinking. So any act of sex during drinking is rape. And yet the man doesn't have the same protections. If a man is drinking, he can give consent and he can be blamed. How does that fit with the idea of gender equality?
There's so many things wrong with this. It's tough to even pick a starting point, but it assumes that men are always the initiators of sex. It assumes that there always is an initiator of sex. When, sometimes it's a mutually reached decision at the same time, or it's a level of mutual agreement, not I'm the person, doing sex onto you. That's such a clinical way of looking at it that doesn't actually take into account the reality and the complication of human sexual activity. And the idea that affirmative consent presents that you have to have consent for each and every single escalating thing is just impossible, that no one does. If this is what it requires, then everyone who's ever had sex is committing rape, because you never ask, may I touch your hand? May I move my hand to your shoulder? May I kiss you? May I use tongue? No one does that. No one ever does that.
But maybe that's the whole point. Maybe the whole point is to define every sex act as rape and give the woman the power later to decide whether or not she's unhappy or has regrets or wants to seek retribution.
Yeah, you have to wonder if that is the goal, because even when you're not taking it to that extreme, essentially all that the standard is doing then is shifting the burden of proof, is telling the man in these disputes where you have to have a preponderance of evidence and you have campus administrators adjudicating who aren't familiar with law, rules of evidence, things of that nature, and they're saying to the man, do you have proof that you didn't commit rape, essentially? And unless he recorded it or has a signed contract, he never does, because this is an activity that happens behind closed doors that there aren't witnesses to. In our justice system and our Western understanding of law, it's the opposite, right? The victim, the aggrieved party, has to prove why she or he was the victim of a crime. And the affirmative consent standard, all it's doing is flipping that relationship such that it's a presumption of guilt.
Could this somehow just be making up for past historical wrongs when the power imbalance was so far in the other direction? Yeah,
well, it comes from a real place of wanting to do something about the fact that women have been taken advantage of historically. And, we're not denying that there isn't sexual assault. And actually, the sexual assault problem in America is worse off college campuses.
Yeah.
College people are privileged. They're wealthy. They're more intelligent. Wealthy, more intelligent people are less likely to commit crimes, and they're less often victims of crime. It's poor, impoverished people in inner cities, minority communities that suffer things like violence and rape. There's a cultural desire to address these historical wrongs and to reduce rape, and that's a good thing. And the criminal justice system has made a lot of progress, actually, in the last few decades about treating women who come forward with respect and not laughing at them and not saying, well, you're married, so your husband always has the right.
Brush it under the rug.
These kinds of ridiculous, antiquated notions that were wrong, that the system and the culture has kind of dismissed. But it's gone way too far, way too overboard, when we give women essentially the license to always claim that they were raped because it's impossible for men to meet the standard of evidence affirmative consent requires in any situation.
Robby, you may not be old enough to remember the daycare sex abuse hysteria of the 1980s, but the country's been through this before. What seems to be different with the campus rape crisis hysteria is that a lot of people, both in and out of government, are making careers out of it, which brings us to Title IX. Remind us what Title IX is and when the current campaign to redefine rape began.
Title IX is innocuous enough seeming provision of the higher education amendments, the law that governs higher education funding in the country. It's been in place for decades, that just asserts that there should be equality between the sexes in higher education funding and programs. If you have a men's sports teams, you should have a women's sports team, comparative equivalent.
Right.
Perfectly fine, perfectly innocuous. But in the last couple years, it has been increasingly interpreted by this obscure federal agency, the Office for Civil Rights, which operates under the Education Department.
Mm-hmm.
They've seized upon this as a call to regulate sexual activity, to give women not equality, but actually greater power over men in these situations. And they have forced colleges. Again, this is just this agency. This is not Congress.
Mm-hmm.
This is just essentially a rogue agency, a symptom of federal bureaucracy run amok, telling colleges what they have to do unless they want to lose federal funding. And of course, no one does. Telling them that they have to hire, under Title IX, armies of administrators to adjudicate these complaints, that they have to treat every complaint as serious. And what should qualify as sexual harassment under Title IX is so open-ended, and it gets open-ended every year. Mm. In 2011, the head of this agency released a Dear Colleague letter that was telling campuses how they had to handle these matters, that was compelling totally unfair prescriptions that were travesty of due process, shifting the burden of proof, requiring affirmative consent, and asserting that all claims have to be investigated. And that can affect professors' speech as well. The case that everyone is familiar with now is Laura Kipnis at Northwestern University, this professor who was actually writing about Title IX, was writing about relationships between students and professors, and a student filed a Title IX complaint against her because she didn't like the article. So now this professor is being investigated for giving her opinion, for writing her opinion, not for actually harassing someone or doing something sexually inappropriate. There was no act.
Right.
It was a statement of views and speech. And, she was ultimately, nothing bad happened, but it's still a chilling effect. If you're going to be investigated for this, she had to speak to lawyers. She couldn't bring her lawyer. She had a representative person to coach her through the process, and that person generated their own Title IX complaints and had to bow out. So it's totally a self-replicating,
it's Kafkaesque at this point
sort of situation that's really chilling of free speech and actual freedom.
An entire parallel judicial apparatus has grown up on college campuses. We've been through several years now of them adjudicating disputes, and we're now into the lawsuit backlash phase. You can't go another week without reading another lawsuit from a young man who was falsely accused, run out of town, his college career ruined, when it turns out that the accusation was false or at least not substantiated. Is that going to continue, or are we going to see this pendulum start to swing?
I think so, but it's difficult to say because the colleges, they're caught between a rock and a hard place, really, because the federal government is saying, this obscure agency of the federal government, I should say, is saying, you have to do this, and then, students whose rights are not respected are saying, well, we're going to sue you for this because we have certain rights under, the U.S. Constitution, under criminal law, and they're going to sue the universities. So the universities are going to get sued either way, and they are being sued either way. And it's going to continue, I think, until there's some guidance from on high, some much higher court decision clarifying that, no, you have to respect students' rights regardless of what this agency says, or direction to the agency from the executive branch that you've exceeded your mandate, or perhaps Congress could get involved. But I see little enthusiasm to do that from actually players in the government. So I kind of expect it to continue as it's unfolding now, whereas the colleges are going to continue to be increasingly told to handle this in ways that are hostile to due process, and it's going to continue to generate a ton of backlash.
If you look at it from the student's perspective, given the current climate, why would any college man in his right mind date a woman from his own school, subjecting himself to Title IX tribunals, when in most places there are so many other schools to choose from?
I think they can get in trouble for dating someone off of their school, and I've seen cases of speech where a student who was not even a member of that university was offended, felt harassed by a student's online social media commenting, and contacted his university, and they investigated him, and I think they suspended him, and eventually FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, was able to intercede and help him. But I'm not even sure if that's your rule, you'll still be safe.
Because I don't think a Title IX sex tribunal has jurisdiction over a non-member of the university.
Well, maybe not, but if we talk to OCR next week, it might be.
They might extend the jurisdiction. Oh, good Lord. It's so hard to put this into a larger context. You know, in the first half of the show, Greg Piper took us through the accelerating explosion of campus efforts to stamp out so-called microaggressions. And a recent paper came out by sociologists Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning with an extraordinary thesis about the underpinnings of all this that helps explain both microaggressions and the rape crisis hysteria. Walk us through that.
Yeah, this is a very interesting paper that I think holds a lot of potential, sheds light on this movement, the trigger warnings and microaggressions that are coming about. What they argue is that over the course of human civilization, we have moved from a culture of honor to a culture of dignity. A culture of honor is one in which you must respond to insults against your person with violence. If I am insulted by you, honor is something you have to defend to have it.
So I challenge you to a duel if you dissed me.
And it would be seen as dishonorable if you were having someone else do your dirty work. You had to guard your honor yourself. In recent centuries, we have, as the Western society has modernized and developed, we've moved, and this is a good thing, we've moved away from that culture to a culture of dignity, one in which all people are assumed to have this intrinsic worth as virtue of being human beings. You have rights and you are worthy of respect, and you don't have to defend it with violence when you're insulted. Actually, you should probably just shrug off minor or trivial slights against yourself. But the really serious ones you would bring before a third-person arbitrator. Maybe that's the government, maybe that's some other institution, to settle your disputes. You're not settling your disputes personally.
As a last resort to a perceived insult.
Right, as a last resort. And this is a better system. There's less violence in this system. This kind of system has grown in corners of the world where there's a strong rule of law culture, like the West, like America. More third world nations are still kind of making this tradition. What these sociologists argue is that college campuses is the ripe environment for a transition to a third, horrifying kind of culture, a culture of victimization that combines aspects of both. A culture where, like the honor culture, you do want to respond to trivial, petty insults. Like under the honor culture, they would be, if you were microaggressed against, yes, you would take care of that. You would respond violently. But we're not responding violently in the victimization culture. We're responding as we would in the dignity culture by bringing our complaints to this third party. And college campuses have all these third-party adjudicators everywhere because of Title IX and all these other things. So you're actually encouraged to see yourself as a perpetual victim of slight and to build a case to bring to a third party that you have been shamed and that you're encouraged to exaggerate, really, the extent of your injuries. And college is the ideal environment for this to foster because disagreements are so slight. Everyone on the campus is actually
equal.
protected. Everyone is equal. Everyone is fairly wealthy and, relative to the world, very well off and very intelligent. So the slight, saying like, oh, where are you from? Or whatever the microaggression happens to be, represents actually a significant insult or blow the way it wouldn't matter in a less equal, less well-off kind of environment. So college campuses are producing this victimization culture, which could have some terrifying, I think, consequences down the road.
Well, people seem to gain status by declaring themselves victims.
Yes, but being a victim gives you tremendous power. And George Will was, he was eviscerated for saying this in a column, but it's undeniably true. And to some extent, the entire Title IX effort, the entire White House effort to better understand and combat sexual assault, is encouraging people to see themselves as victims. Because these surveys that produce the 1 in 5 statistic never say, are you a victim of sexual assault? They say, well, were you in this situation? Had you had something to drink? Did you brush up against someone and did it make you uncomfortable?
Right.
And then when the students say yes, they say, well, you're a victim of sexual assault according to our purposes. This method is always going to create more victims of sexual assault.
And not just sexual assault. Whoever racks up the most victimhood stories has the highest status.
Yeah, and social media, I think, encourages that to some degree because it gives tremendous power, and it almost gives you veto power if you've had some trauma. And you see this occasionally where people try to, out-trauma each other. Well, this happened to me. Well, this happened to me. And in that way, it's the opposite of an honor culture where you're encouraged to make yourself seem larger and more powerful and more impervious than you actually are. Here we're kind of racing to the bottom to portray ourselves as pathetic and weak and, pushovers to trivial insults.
Well, when are we going to start seeing white male victimhood groups?
Well, yeah, right. Well, we do see some of those groups, and I don't want to go too far and say white males have enjoyed tons of advantages. They still do enjoy tons of advantages, but we should be realistic about campus sexual assault. We should be realistic about that if you're applying to college, it helps to be a politically favored minority, maybe not an Asian Asian applicant, but a politically favored minority. So there are areas where it is harder to be a white male. I don't want to pretend that white males haven't benefited over the centuries from lots of privilege and power, but we should strive for equality before the law now, treating everyone fairly and equitably, and not assuming all men are going to be rapists or giving women the tools to accuse all men of being rapists, even when it's going to end up being very few of them have actually done anything wrong.
So, Robby, in all this chaos, is there reason for optimism?
Well, I think there's reason for optimism in that there's a growing recognition that this is a problem, and that recognition is cross-partisan, it's cross-ideological. Voices on the right and the libertarian right have been complaining about this for a while, but I think there's a greater than ever, or at least greater than ever in the last decade, realization on the left that this also threatens the free expression and academic freedom for leftist thinkers, and that this is a kind of unhealthy, extreme progressivism that's obsessed with identity politics, and that's actually damaging to the left. Voices in New York Magazine, like Jonathan Chait, you have comedians like Bill Maher, who are kind of calling out this culture along with everyone else. I suspect that even the places like Jezebel, which have, kind of pushed along this rape culture hysteria, are aware that the beast has kind of gone beyond what they intended, and there's this just greater awareness that it's a problem we have to confront.
Well, let's hope you're right and common sense reigns again. Robby, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was Robby Soave from Reason.com here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program, now broadcast in 11 cities and online. If you'd like to help us expand, please stop by realclearradio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.